This is Brent Allan Winters, commonlawyer.com. That's commonlawyer.com, and this is part 19 of a series wherein we attempt to discover the applicability of our Declaration of 76 to our circumstances here and now as Americans in the United States. We come now to paragraph 9 of the Declaration of 76, which is the last paragraph under the heading of that document wherein the colonists complain that King George III is attempting to end local government in the American colonies, which of course is part of our common law tradition, and he wants to substitute for that his imperial will. And we've said many times before, we'll say it again because it bears repeating, he claimed to be king of England, and the king under a common law government such as England's, under their common law constitution, is a limited office of a limited power, very limited as a matter of fact, and the office of emperor is not limited, it is unlimited in an earthly sense, and local government is not part of its element. It is rule of a country from a distant country, or of a territory from a city, and for that reason it's called city law, in Latin, civil law. They say this in paragraph 9. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migration hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. Now, underlying all of the common law tradition is the law of the land, and though the phrase has been around for much longer than Magna Carta, it is there that people most often cite to it its extant beginnings, on paper anyway, the law of the land, lex terra, or, as some people say, land law, because its roots arise from property rights in land use. This is not, as we say, the law of the city, it is the law of the land, and it has to do mostly having arisen out of farming communities, where land was foundational to all in their understanding. And though land is still foundational to all, it is not foundational in the understanding of most people anymore. They do not see the connection between land and the stability of their country. Land is important, even to fight a war for anything other than the occupation of real estate. Dirt, land, territory is a water hole. That means it's a waste of time. And indeed, that has been taught at the War College, the Naval War College, for many years. All experience and all of history teaches us that. We cannot expect to go into another country and fight without taking dominance over the territory, the land. As we tried to do in Vietnam, it didn't work. As we tried to do in Korea, it didn't work. As we professed we were going to do in Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries, and it doesn't work. If we don't take land and occupy and dominate land and take over the territory, war is a waste of time. But because our common law grew from among farmers and miners, its principles are foremost seen in the individual's lordship, that is stewardship, lordship's the old word, over land, that is his rights and property, and his property in those rights. By contrast, the civil law or city law tradition is about government lording it over people, not taking lordship over land, but lording it over people. Thus, civil law-minded government will permit entry onto uninhabited land only when it has means to dominate those people entering that land. And remember here, the complaint is that King George III has refused to pass laws to encourage migration, and he has raised the conditions of appropriation of lands. In fact, the word territory comes from the civil law tradition, signifying that land area over which Rome had extended her terror over its inhabitants. Civil law government dominates and controls through terrorism, the inciting of fear of others or of that government itself. Is that applicable today? What is the war on terror designed to do? Number one, to incite fear in Americans of other people from other lands, and number two, to give opportunity to the government to terrorize people, which it is now doing in spades as it has never done in America before. At common law, any government that tries to ban or hinder habitation and profitable use of that country's uninhabited and dormant land flies in the face of God, because land is God's blessing to mankind. By it, man can live. Without it, man dies. Consequently, God wills that his uninhabited earth, that is his land, be always open to entry and good stewardship, because the land and its wealth are his, and he says he wants them exploited. By first principle of the common law and Scripture, the landowner that neglects to put his land to good use must yield it to the one aggressive enough to do so. Thus, says Monahan, the common law recognizes what's called adverse possession. I'll quote old Monahan. He says, "It is that strange and wonderful teaching that encourages production to the good of all." And by this same principle, America's homestead law of 1862 opened her inhabited, tillable lands to entry, and her mining law of 1872 has opened her mineral lands. The Homestead Act is now fulfilled and of no more force. The mining law of 1872 is not fulfilled. The mineralized lands of America are not inhabited, and it is still in force. And all mining on federal government land is under that 1872 law. Well, virgin land in most of the 13 American colonies was available clean west to the Mississippi River. But as Nimrod at Babylon, King George and his cronies wanted the colonists crowded close together along the seaboard, handy for ease of fleecing, using their tax-supported trading and banking monopolies. Understand something about government. Government, when it cannot control people, panics. For example, when the California gold rush kicked off 1848-1849, within a few short months there were 100,000 miners in what is now the state of California. Well, immediately, by 1850, they knew they could apply for statehood. It only takes 60,000 people in a territory under the Constitution to apply for statehood, and they did so. But even though there were 100,000 miners, and many more than that were already there were only 10,000 federal troops in the San Francisco Bay Area. And Congress was beside themselves, not knowing what to do, thinking that they had a responsibility to control all that. That is the nature of government. And here, King George and Parliament and the cronies and the Bank of London, of which they were chief beneficiaries, many of them, wanted control of the colonies, and they knew they could not control the colonies if the colonists were free to spread out over the land. Well, just the opposite, of course. That's what's made America a powerful nation, because America has always had a policy of spreading out over the land until very recently. In the last 40 years has begun a movement to exit the land and populate and crowd into cities, and it's been going on ever since. This plan began long ago, but it really picked up steam in the 1930s when the banks claimed they lost their money. Of course, they didn't. They just sent it on up the line to bankers elsewhere, further away, who had control of them in Europe, stole American people's money. They weren't able to pay the mortgage payments on their land or farm it, even to buy seed, and so a mass exodus began from the southern states to the northern cities, from the western states, the agricultural lands, to the west coast, and the land was depopulated. And then the land was further depopulated as federal programs began to build dams that covered many states and forced people off land for lakes, but even worse, just to set land aside as national land and force people off of their farms and off of their mining claims. Hundreds of thousands of people. In southern Illinois, I've talked to people down there in the Shawnee National Forest. Older people that have told me about how nice it was there when they lived there and they grew up on farms there. And now how it's a tangled mess after the federal government got hold of the land and planted a whole lot of trees and bushes and shrubs there that were not native to the area. And now it's not only uninhabitable, but unprofitable. Never forget, what belongs to everybody belongs to nobody. And it is axiomatic that the government of the United States, or even state governments, are unfit as trustees of anything, and if you don't believe it, go ask the American Indian who lives on land that is put in trust to the government of the United States. Would you trust your property to Congress, for example? If you wouldn't, then you may understand why the American Indian feels the way he does about federal land trusts. Now we come to paragraph 10 of our Constitution of 76, and he starts off with a new heading. Paragraphs 3 through 9 were about doing away with local legislatures, and paragraphs 10 through 14 complain of King George III's attempts to do away with local courts and common law courts with common law judges. It says this: "He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. Indeed, a tyrant, always known by his doings, forever tries to replace common law's adversarial, oral, and public jury trials with civil laws, inquisitional, secret tribunals, using admiralty, martial, and canon law." And our Declaration of 76 talks about all three of these these abuses. The soul of our common law is its courts, and the heart of its courts are the jury. As long as the heart throbs, the soul quickens, and as long as juries decide cases, freedom is alive, and government cannot be total. But here our Declaration charges the king with violating common law's separation of powers requirement by stopping the establishment of judiciary powers. He meant to displace the power of our common law courts to interpret the law with his will. Remember, the civil law is a law of men, that is, the will of men, and not law, the principles of law. More to the point, by disallowing courts, King George III does away with the jury, thereby putting all litigants at his mercy in admiralty tribunals and not that of their neighbors or peers sitting on a jury. Again, the British powers that be, by claiming the common law has no authority in the colonies, replaced the jury with civil law's admiralty courts. The several revenue acts, said the First Continental Congress, which extend the powers of admiralty courts beyond their ancient limits, deprive the American of trial by jury. Close quote. They understood this well. The colonies understood exactly what King George III and Parliament was attempting to do. They were attempting to take the common law out of the colonies. The core goal of the king and his cronies was to keep their monopolies of power over trade through the East India Company and banking through England's Central Bank of London. Now these beasts, both of them, were fed with tax revenues collected by British bayonets and Hessian swords. But to do so required taking trial by jury from the colonists by bringing them under the control of admiralty law, which uses no jury. Never forget, says Devlin, without trial by jury all are under the merciless power of the state. Tyrants seek to overthrow or diminish trial by jury, Devlin says, for no tyrant could afford to leave a subject's freedom in the hands of 12 of his countrymen. So that trial by jury is more than an instrument of justice and more than one wheel of the Constitution. It is the lamp that shows that freedom lives. To sum up, admiralty jurisdiction has no jury, and because admiralty tribunals have no jury, being a civil law tribunal concerning ships and shipping and sailors on the high seas, since they have no jury, if the king could get all litigants and all litigation under the admiralty courts, he could do away with the jury and control the colonists. And remember, too, the admiralty courts are under the jurisdiction of the executive power, in this case, the King of England. And courts that are under the jurisdiction of the executive power and not part of that third branch of government called the judicial branch are under control of the executive. So he has the power to not only enforce the law, but also to interpret it if anybody questions his enforcement. And that's what's happening here. This is Brent Allan Winters, commonlawyer.com, and this is part 19 in a series exploring the applicability of our Declaration of 76 here